Keir Starmer today delivered his first address to Labour conference as party leader. The message was pretty clear. I'm not Jeremy Corbyn. And by the way, I love Britain. Let's take a look.
We're becoming a competent, credible opposition. But that's not enough. I didn't come into politics to be in opposition, and neither did you. I came into politics to change lives. But you don't get the permission to act unless the public trusts you. And we still have a lot to do. I don't underestimate the work that will be needed. But I can make this promise. Never again will Labour go into an election not being trusted on national security, with your job, with your community, and with your money. That's what being under new leadership means. And the best incentive for being deadly serious about victory is to remember why we want to win. I don't want to win power just to be Prime Minister. I want to win because of the country I love and because of the values I hold dear. When you win, you come out of the shadows. You change lives. You make a difference to your country. To do that, we must once again be the party of the whole United Kingdom, the party of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. We must make the case much more persuasively that we achieve more together than we do alone, to stop the nationalists ripping our country apart by design, and to stop the Tories dismantling it by neglect.
Speech won lots of plaudits from the commentariat. People say, yes, it's very good. He's done exactly what he needs to do, which is show that the party's under new management, say that he's patriotic, that he loves Britain, etc., etc. My one critique, I mean, maybe there's going to be a bunch of critiques that we have, but my initial one is that it's a little bit on the nose, isn't it? You can see it's almost as if he's explaining his strategy to the public. So they've obviously had a meeting in the leader of the opposition's office, and they said, what do we need to do? We need to show that we're not Jeremy Corbyn. We need to show that we're competent, and we need to show that we're patriotic. And sort of instead of, crafting this into a more sort of interesting artistic narrative, he's basically stood up there and said, look, I'm not Jeremy Corbyn, I'm really damn competent, and by the way, I love this country. And there was sort of it wasn't dressed up in any way that you didn't have to read between the lines, let's put it like that.
I mean, effectively, like I said, I'm not Jeremy Corbyn, anti-Semitism, that was terrible, wasn't it? He was introduced by Ruth Smith. Why do you think Ruth Smith lost her seat? It was because of the Brexit position that Keir Starmer primarily engineered within the party. Not just him, of course. And of course, it was very popular with Labour members. We shouldn't say anything other than that. But there was just no mention of that. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But it was very odd. Family. I love my country. The last guy. I mean, and a lot of people aren't going to buy it because a lot of people are going to say, well, you what? Hold on a second. You were in his shadow cabinet. He couldn't have been that bad if you were willing to serve underneath him. Hold on a second. You're saying that we need to embrace the reasons why we just why Labour lost the last general election, yet you're not taking any responsibility for the role you played and the fundamental reason why they lost by such a huge overwhelming margin. Not the only reason, but the primary reason, which was their Brexit policy. And there's no ownership of that. And I think until that happens, until he bears a little bit of public responsibility for that, people will think, I think with great justification, wow, he's a bit shifty and untrustworthy. That's my view. Because the Tories will go for it. The Tories aren't going to ignore it. They haven't got any other. Look, there are attack lines. Do you love your country? He's neutralising that. Okay. Do you love your family? Family values. He's neutralising that. They're going to neutralise him on the stuff that actually is quite justified. Well, if you're such a change from Corbyn, how are you in a shadow cabinet? One. If you're so willing to accept the Brexit vote now, why didn't you do it for 2 years? Two. That's what they're going to go on, and ultimately Keir Starmer's going to have to try. He's going to have to try and neutralise those as well. And right now he's walking towards some things he wants to neutralise because guess what? It means attacking the left, and he's not walking towards other things he needs to neutralise. Guess why? Because actually they're not particularly popular. So interesting.
I think there's something to that. I'm not really sure. I think from a strategic perspective, it's clear what they're trying to do. They're trying to win back voters in the Red Wall who didn't like Jeremy Corbyn, didn't like the Remain position. And yes, it might seem irritating that now he is sort of putting as much clear water as possible between the Labour Party and that Remain position, which he himself crafted. It might be irritating, but I can see why they don't want to have a mea culpa where he has to stand up and say, yes, I wrote that Brexit policy.
No, doesn't he say that?
I mean, I think the idea that he just says sort of, we're not doing that anymore, and basically he's just trashing Corbyn loads, is, it seems to be electorally sensible, even if it's a bit grating.
Well, before we came on air, I was listening to Radio 5 Live, and people calling in saying precisely that. They say, well, he just seems quite shifty. How can he denigrate his predecessor if he worked alongside him for a couple of years? If he thought he was a racist and anti-Semite, and if he thought he was no good and he was useless, he couldn't win an election, he shouldn't have served under him. And the Tories will say that, and I think that's kind of justified, isn't it? It's kind of fair.
So how would you neutralise that, though?
Well, I'm not Keir Starmer's advisor. I mean, I would do lots of things differently to what he's doing. But it's interesting how they are consciously neutralising issues where it means they attack the left and they're ignoring the other ones. But, why? That's an interesting question.
Let's talk about patriotism. This pissed off a lot of people today. I may be pissed off some people by sort of tweeting that I don't think it's as big a problem as people make out. As I mentioned, I mean, in the briefing to the press, this was a lot about, Keir Starmer's going to give a patriotic pitch. He kept saying, I love my country. That was a big deal. And we are going to look at a graphic that the Labour Party put up. So this is graphic 5. And again, this is not very subtle. It's superimposed onto a Union Jack. And it's a quote from Keir Starmer. I want this to be the best country to grow up in and the best country to grow old in. It's a bit, it's when you hear American presidents sort of saying America is the last great hope of humanity, it seems a bit silly, but also I don't find that particularly offensive. It was Lisa Nandy's comments on Radio 4 that really pissed people off. So while trailing Starmer's speech, she said the following, and this is going to be a tweet from Rachel Shabby, who's quoting her and then giving her commentary. So let's go to that tweet. Lisa Nandy on Radio 4 today on what has changed for Labour. We stand up for Britain, we stand up for British people, we stand up for British interests, and we always put that first. And then Rachel Shabby adds, got it, from now on it will be Britain first. And obviously this translation of it to be Britain first upset a lot of people. And it's debatable whether or not one can infer Britain first from what Lisa Nandy said. I want to get your opinions on this, Aaron. What did you make of what Lisa Nandy actually said on Radio 4 and then the social media response, the social media backlash afterwards?
Well, in typical Lisa Nandy style, she then went on the television and said something completely different.
What did she say on the television?
She just said something, she sounded quite committed to the kind of policy platform that Starmer was outlining during the leadership campaign. And this is something we see with Lisa Nandy repeatedly. And it came to light particularly during the leadership campaign. She ran her own leadership campaign. I don't rate a lot of these politicians. I'm sorry. They try and talk with authority about things they don't really know about. She would say, "Oh, we did this. We defended freedom in Rwanda." Well, actually, if you read, for instance, the work of Mark Curtis, Britain's record with regards to the Rwandan genocide is pretty bad for a number of reasons. Web of Deceit, good book to read if you want to know more about that. I just feel like they're not particularly serious politicians. She's a good media performer, but Lisa Nandy has often said things that are just wildly different, and I think that's partly because she's a proper politician. She's an opportunist. As is Keir Starmer, by the way. This is one thing we need to say, and I actually admire the guy for it. He is being brutal and ruthless. He pitched himself as a sort of social liberal. He pitched himself as the human rights lawyer, the socialist, the trade union advocate. How many times do you think the word poverty was mentioned in today's speech?
I don't know, actually. Was it never mentioned?
0.
Wow.
How many times was housing mentioned in today's speech?
I'm going to guess 0 now. Once. Okay. I thought if I just go for the same answer as last time, I might get it wrong. But anyway.
How many times was childcare mentioned?
Once.
I think it was 0, I think.
Okay, fuck, again.
But then you think security, family, these were mentioned repeatedly. And by the way, we can talk more about family values in a second. But people are saying, oh, Clement Attlee could have given that speech. No, Clement Attlee could not have given a 25-minute speech where he did not mention poverty once. No, he couldn't have done that, actually. It could have been from Keir Hardie. No, Keir Hardie in his speech has said abolish landlordism. He didn't say, nothing about the fact that we have 3-4 kids living in a 2-bed flat in London while we have developers buying up houses and turning them into doss houses and bedsits. Keir Hardie would have called that out. And instead, Keir Starmer, his priority, and you might think it's justified, but Keir Hardie certainly wouldn't have done it, was to attack and denigrate the left to neutralise a political weak point.
Let's look at another clip, and this one, I will agree with you, does make Keir Starmer look pretty shifty, and it is pretty annoying. So this is Lisa Nandy speaking on Politics Live. And she seems to suggest that Keir Starmer is just, ready to scrap all of the 10 pledges, which he sort of put front and centre of his leadership campaign.
Keir Starmer has said many times recently, and Annalisa Dodds, that they don't want to raise taxes. It's a pledge we often hear from Conservative leaders, less so from Labour. But when Keir Starmer was running to be Labour leader, it was a different time. He had 10 pledges. The very first pledge was to raise taxes, income tax for high earners and also corporation tax. Is that now gone?
Well, I expect so, based on what you just said, that, in the middle of a global pandemic where people are really struggling, they're not just losing jobs. A lot of people, don't forget, are taking cuts in hours or cuts in pay in order to keep their jobs. The idea of raising taxes and squeezing people who are in work and trying to make ends meet, it's just completely the wrong priority for the country.
Has he ditched all of his 10 pledges, including the fifth one to nationalise rail, mail, energy and water?
I think giving the public much more control over how those things work, so that they work in the public interest, is right. I mean, I had the privilege of being in that leadership contest alongside Keir and the other candidates,
Yes.
and so and one of the things that we all set out is we want to see those public utilities work much better in the interests of
but
people.
nationalising them.
There are different ways to do that, and I think bringing them back into public hands is one way of doing it. Giving the public much more control is another. The energy industry, for example. One of the things that I set out when I was Shadow Energy Secretary is we'd like to see the public having much more control over the way that is directed, which means breaking up the dominance of the big six and bringing new entrants into the market.
I try to be fair to the Labour leadership. And when they say we're not here to write detailed policies for a general election, which is in 2024, I think fair enough. I obviously think they should be taking much stronger positions on issues which are live now. For example, housing, for example, people who are shielding, not getting enough help, for example, people getting bullied back into work, things that they stayed shamefully silent on, really. But when it comes to tax policy, I can see why they might want to hold their cards close to their chest. But even on those terms, even accepting that was a terrible answer. So one, Aaron was talking earlier, Keir Starmer can look a bit shifty. He made promises. This wasn't like his politics 5 years ago. These 10 pledges, which he made to Labour Party members, was less than a year ago. It was a few months ago. He said, I pledge. It's also not a suggestion, it's a pledge. It's the kind of thing that if you were Ed Miliband, you'd engrave into a tombstone. These are supposed to be real commitments. And he committed to raising taxes on the top 5% to create a more equal society. Now she's just said, doesn't seem like that's the policy anymore. I mean, she could have said, look, we're going to give you a detailed tax policy in 4 years' time. But obviously, we believe in a more equal society. So we'll have to see what comes out of that, development of our policies. But she didn't say, she just trashed it like it didn't matter at all. And the bit that I thought was really unforgivable there is that the prospect of tax rises is increased. And without being pressed on it, she just introduces this incredibly right-wing false frame, which is to suggest that any kind of tax rises is squeezing people who are in work and trying to make ends meet. Now, if you increase taxes on the top 5% of society, you are not increasing taxes on people who are in work and trying to make ends meet. I mean, they might be in work, but they can definitely afford to pay a little bit more for the millions of people in this country who are languishing in poverty. So this idea, this incredibly right-wing frame that any increase in taxes is a punishment on working people is absolutely something which not only is it immoral for Labour frontbenchers to be enforcing, it's self-defeating because we are going to have an argument about tax.
She's also the Shadow Foreign Secretary. It's not her role. I just find it weird that she's freestyling on tax and spend policy. I find it bizarre. If she was, if she had some sort of brief there, if it was Pat McFadden, who's very right-wing, but at least that's his neck of the woods, you kind of understand it. It's very strange. Imagine Emily Thornberry 2 years ago. She had the same brief under Jeremy Corbyn, and she starts talking about, whether or not the top 5% should be taxed more. And what's really striking is that the Tories come to power and they say, what's the first thing we can do for our people? Let's cut corporation tax. Let's make it easier to fire people. Let's make it easier to accumulate really exceptionally valuable property portfolios. Let's reward the people who've supported us so far and give them political sinecures in various civil society organisations or as special advisors. That's what the Tories do. They look after their people. Meanwhile, Labour, we've got unprecedented child poverty in recent decades right now, not even in the context of COVID. We've got falling home ownership. We've got massive indebtedness. We're about to see, we have had a return now to evictions after a temporary suspension. And all Lisa and Andy's talking about is, what she's primarily talking about is how the top 5% of earners can't afford to pay more tax. I mean, this is the equivalent of this is like a leading Tory going onto the BBC and saying we need to repeal Thatcher's trade union laws. That's the equivalent. And until this changes, and as long as Labour has leading figures talking like this in a public arena, I don't think they'll win office. I don't think they'll win an election with that. I don't think anybody will be enthused. They might form a minority government. They're not going to win a big majority like that. They'll probably not win office, but they certainly won't win power. Because all you'll be doing, if you do win office, is be able to deliver a prospectus that the Tories are perfectly happy with because you've adopted all their lines. And this is a really important point to say. Arguably, since the mid-1970s, Labour may have been in office, but they have not been in power because they are swallowing whole and regurgitating the common sense and the talking points of the Conservative Party and big business. Go to bat for people who can't make ends meet. Go to bat for people who use food banks, who can't get on the property ladder. Go to bat for people who can't get their kids into a decent school. Don't talk about how the top 5% can't afford to pay a bit more tax, because it's not true.
We're going to finish very soon. First of all, I do just want to mention Ruth Smeeth. So she introduced Keir Starmer. She was MP for Stoke-on-Trent until she lost in the 2019 general election. And you can see, again, I don't think the people who work for Keir Starmer are stupid. You can see why they've done this. They want to put clear water between Jeremy Corbyn on anti-Semitism, and she was a strong critic of Jeremy Corbyn on anti-Semitism. And they want to say our priority is to win back the Red Wall, and she lost a seat in the Red Wall. The problem for me, though, was Keir Starmer says that, and this is a quote, that Smeeth exemplifies the values I want the Labour Party to stand for. And my problem with this is because it's who Ruth Smeeth is, right? What her background, what her decisions, what jobs she's taken tells us about what she stands for. And yes, she was an MP for Stoke-on-Trent. You can see why he wants to put her front and centre. In her previous career, she was a deputy director for Hope Not Hate. Fine, that's the kind of thing that you might, expect people to say, oh, that's a good Labour value. But before that, she was director of public affairs and campaigns at BICOM, which is what The Guardian described as. It's not left, it's not like a crank outlet. I don't really like that term, but anyway, I'm using the terms of the right. They say this is Britain's most active pro-Israel lobbying organisation. And in an article in 2009, they sort of describe what it does. They say BICOM, which claims to be an independent organisation devoted to seeking a more supportive environment for Israel, is at the forefront of the campaign to win over the British media. Foreign reporters are bombarded with press releases and invitations to interview senior Israeli ministers and advisors at top London restaurants. Set up in 2001, it has regularly flown journalists to Tel Aviv. So Smeeth has also worked for PR for Nestle, right? And I think why this matters is because Keir Starmer has, he said, I think we even admit that the way the Labour Party dealt with anti-Semitism was a bit of a mess. I think our analysis differs from Keir Starmer's, for example, on the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, and in particular its examples. So I can see why they want to draw clear water and don't want to have a big public row about it. But they also do have a responsibility to make it seem like they can be fair brokers when it comes to international policy, and in particular with respect to Israel-Palestine, because right now, Palestinian people feel completely, sold out by the Labour Party, partly because of adopting the IRA definition, but because of a number of other reasons. There was actually a public letter from a number of prominent British Palestinians, which was released last week on precisely this subject. And then to say someone embodies Labour values who has had a job in an organisation whose sole purpose is to lobby for a country which is, undertaking the expansion of illegal settlements to dispossess a people right now, breaking international law, killing unarmed protesters. I think in the period that she worked there, that was just before another war on Gaza. So you can see that we're talking here about someone who is quite ideologically aligned with a state which is, committing human rights abuses against people who, many Labour members rightly care about. I mean, I care about human rights abuses against anyone. And so I think to pick that particular person as embodying Labour values does show quite a lot of disrespect to Labour members who care about Palestine, and above all, to Palestinians, to Labour members who are also Palestinians, because there are many of them.
Agree more. And prior, as long as working at BICOM, as well as working at BICOM, as well as working at Nestle, she worked briefly at Sodexo, which is like an outsourcing giant. These aren't people from the Labour movement, right? When we talk about the Tolpuddle martyrs, they're celebrated every summer from Dorset. They committed the crime of unlawful vows they were transported to Australia, Tasmania, for basically starting a trade union in Dorset. Their leader was a gentleman called George Lovelace. Now, today, fast forward, people like Nestle and Sodexo, people like Edelman, where Luciana Berger and Chuka Umanan now work, as well as many other people, by the way, that previously associated with Tony Blair. Edelman today, as we talked about so many times, were engaged in a classic astroturfing, anti-worker effort against workers who were trying to organise at Walmart, right? Edelman and Sodexo are not the inheritors of the Tolpuddle martyrs and of George Lovelace. They're the inheritors of the people that sent them to Tasmania in Australia, right? So what kind of people do you want in the Labour Party today as its MPs? Do you want the people who are the inheritors of George Lovelace, the shop stewards, the people on the shop floor, the people who are manning the food banks, the people who are organising workers for a better wage, the people involved in social movements for justice and equality? Do you want them? Or do you want the press officers for Sodexo and the directors for Edelman and the PR and policy people for these organisations which rig the economy for billionaires and millionaires? I think I know which one I would rather have represented for the Labour Party. Clue is in the name. Keir Starmer appears to disagree, as he quite forthrightly said this morning, which again asks questions about the kind of politics that he himself is personally committed to.